Welcome back, and we're going to tackle yet another element of development today. In this lesson, we're going to be reviewing the concept of adaptive development. When we look at the idea of adaptive development across individuals and throughout the lifespan, we have to go again on a journey together, really considering the development from infant to adult, or this idea that we call womb to tomb. And it sounds a little ridiculous, and it really would be to think that we can cover all of the milestones that occur during this time throughout an entire course, let alone one class. So we're not looking to understand what are all the skills that happen across the adaptive development of an individual and their lifespan, but we want you to have an overall bigger takeaway for the appreciation of the process of adaptive development and what we're going to be reaching for as a general concept of what this entails. The objectives for this class are going to be, number one, to define adaptive development. So at the end of this class, hopefully you'll be able to define what adaptive development is and what it means. Number two, we're going to identify the elements of adaptive development. So what makes up adaptive development and how does this look when we break it down? Number three, we're going to identify the behaviors that correspond with adaptive development. So being able to actually classify what are the behaviors that we would see falling within those domains that make up the general concept of adaptive development. And number four, apply strategies that could promote and assist in the adaptive development of an individual. And of course, we have to keep in mind that this is an introduction class, so we're going to be covering an overview, but we're also going to get to know the process, what the concept of adaptive development means, and how we might apply it to our overall understanding and thought process. I encourage you, as we move through this PowerPoint, to really open up your mind to the amazing details that develop within an individual throughout our own innate abilities, the interactions of the environment and the people in our lives, along with the concept of temperament and the behaviors that are expressed as a child is growing and developing throughout this time and in their adaptive development. So allow yourself to think critically about the idea of adaptive development and use the prior knowledge that you've gained through this course so far in terms of thinking and the other developmental domains to begin applying this additional concept. So let's begin by first moving through the concept of adaptive development. What is adaptive development, and why is this a relevant developmental domain to consider? So as you can see from this slide, we've already evaluated cognitive, language, and physical development in the context of our dive into the domains. As a review, when we consider cognitive development, we're discussing the changes in thinking, decision-making, and reasoning that occur over time and throughout the lifespan of an individual. Physical development is constituted by the changes in the body, due both to genetics and environmental nourishment and stimulation. Additionally, we can break physical development down into two categories, which include gross and fine motor. Gross motor development is referring to the larger muscle movements that we can enact, such as running, jumping, walking, climbing, whereas fine motor movements are those much more small and yet skill-based precision movements that we use, such as buttoning buttons and tying shoes. Finally, in language development, we've discussed the changes that occur over time in the way that the individual is able to express and understand language. There are two forms of communication, which include the expressive abilities, which is how we express language outward into the world, and also receptive language, which we would refer to as the way in which an individual forms an understanding of language that is conveyed to them. Both of these elements have a critical role in the individual's ability to communicate. So, moving along to the topic of focus today, we're now going to examine adaptive development. Adaptive development refers to the way in which an individual changes over time in their ability to care for themselves in their day-to-day life. This, as you might imagine, takes on many forms throughout the lifespan. At the age of 2, we wouldn't necessarily expect a child to be balancing a checkbook, but we might expect them to be learning to eat using silverware or helping to dress themselves by lifting their arms and pushing it through the sleeve. As you begin to break down these behaviors, you will also begin to identify just how many skills are necessary to live life independently and successfully on a day-to-day basis. One point to also consider, while at the age of 2, an American family may expect a child to begin using silverware, in some Asian cultures, this independent use of silverware may occur at a much later time, and instead a child might be fed by the parents. So when we discuss this idea of adaptive development, we really also have to take into account an individual's cultural norms, which we'll begin to discuss in more detail later in the slides. Now that we understand what adaptive development is as a whole, we're going to further break these down for consideration, and you will see on the slide that we can conceptualize adaptive development as 3 overarching domains. And you might notice that the skills that you find yourself completing on a daily basis can be placed into at least one of these categories. As you might see from the table, all of these skills are necessary to function and someday live independently. With difficulties in any of these areas, there can be significant challenges throughout the span of a lifetime. So let's further break these apart. We're going to look at the first domain, which constitutes the conceptual skills and understanding. When we consider the conceptual skill development, we have to look at an individual's ability to use their basic thinking skills in a way that promotes a general understanding of money concepts, reading, writing, and language. Think for a moment how your life would be different if you had difficulty with the conceptualization of money or an inability to write or read. Think for a moment about how many times you use these skills throughout the day. The second domain includes the element of social skills. While we will be examining these more in detail in the social-emotional development section, for now, think of these in terms of an individual's general social skills. For example, the ability to relate to others in a way that fosters your experience on a day-to-day basis. Think about the interactions that you've had with others, or what would be typical on a relatively typical day. This also includes the elements such as being cautious or worry, and being in the environment, understanding and following those societal roles that really keep you safe on a day-to-day basis, respecting personal boundaries, and knowing if somebody's trying to take advantage of you. So this social domain lets us consider how life would be different if any of these skills were underdeveloped. And then finally, in adaptive development, there's a consideration for the general practical skills that afford daily living. This may look like personal hygiene, general safety, like not walking down the middle of a busy street, but staying on the sidewalk and waiting for the walk sign. Knowing and understanding the ways in which you can access public transportation in the event that your car breaks down, and the skills that allow you to become employable. So all of this encompasses the practical elements of adaptive development. We tend as a society to really take these elements of development for granted, thinking that they just happen as we age. While the truth is that in order for these skills to develop, we must first possess the cognitive ability to understand the skills that are presented, and the environment must present these skills to be learned. So now we know what adaptive development is, and that there are 3 general domains that make up adaptive development. And believe it or not, we actually have assessment tools to measure the adaptive skill development in individuals over the context of their lifespan. There are several examples presented here, and we're going to explore several others in our preparation work to dig a little bit deeper into this. So at this time, we have to understand that adaptive development is viewed according to the age of the child and what would be considered typical for that stage. As stated earlier, we wouldn't expect a child at the age of 2 to be engaging in the use of the stove to cook a meal, but by the age of 14, we might expect that an adolescent would be capable of making a simple dish for themselves. And this brings us to the next point of focus. These expectations are different depending upon the culture and your environment. For example, we wouldn't expect a child at the age of 2 to be using a stove, but would you feel comfortable with a child using a knife to cut their own food? Think about this for a moment. So how about a machete to open a piece of fruit? Now this child is 11 months old and is being taught to use a machete. This comes out of a book by Barbara Rogoff, a sociocultural researcher who's aiming to bring to light the cultural expectations and how this is independently defined by the culture. Personally, I still get a little nervous when I see my kids of 11 and 15 cutting their own steak. But that's because I grew up in American culture, and I've adopted the expectations and the fears that have been placed upon me in this cultural context. So while we would not necessarily want to encourage this in our American culture, we must be able to see this independent life skill development as different within various cultures and ways of life. In America, we might consider the appropriate adaptive skills at this age to be developing the conceptual skills through activities such as looking at books and reading to children and having them point to items that we say out loud, which would also promote their receptive language development as well, because these are the skills that will develop over time to provide for a foundation of independent living in our future. Whereas the Republic of Congo, this is a different way of life, and value is placed on the context of their specific needs and skills within their specific lifestyle. All of this should serve to really widen your perspective or your lens regarding the adaptive development skills, depending upon age and culture, and our need for an open mind for the diversity that can exist when we look outside of our current perspective or culture. So we have discussed adaptive development as changes in the way that the individual is able to care for oneself in their daily living skills, which can then be broken down into 3 components of conceptual, social, and practical skills. Under this umbrella, we recognize that our conceptualization of this adaptive development is highly dependent upon the individual genetic makeup, the environment in which they reside, and their stimulation and support, along with their individual temperament and those interactions with others. We also recognize the age and the culture, and we must be aware of and in respect of different cultural values and norms in order to fully conceptualize adaptive development.